Chapter 10. The storm was one of the worst that Gud had ever seen. The wind howled, branches bowed and leaves scattered like oversized confetti. Small trees and saplings became contorted, while shrubs were plucked clean from the ground and whisked away to oblivion. Buildings and rooftops took a battering, and anything that wasn't securely fixed was ripped up and sent crashing into stone walls or smashed through glass windows. Greenhouses were destroyed, sheds flattened, and chimneys toppled everywhere. It was reported in the Daily Gud and the Guardian Gazette how children were propelled from playgrounds as if fired from catapults. They told also how elderly spinsters were lifted up into the sky to heights greater than church steeples, while below unmanned coaches careered out of control along causeways, ending their independence deep within the stinky palace moat. Woe betides anyone foolish enough to be out in such weather. Palace Gud survived remarkably unscathed, given its dilapidated state. A few roof tiles were torn free and sent skimming across its courtyard and gardens, and half a dozen window panes blew in, blasting shards of crystallized shrapnel into bedchambers. Splidge's cowshed suffered a near miss when a large evergreen uprooted and plunged onto the small lean-to at the rear. A couple of feet the other way, and the Cragflinger's abode would resemble a flat pack. Splidge would rather have been in the flimsy shack and taken his chances against tumbling fir trees than cowering in a muddy hole up to his ankles in water. The island offered little protection against the force of the storm, but Splidge, Doreen and the Crag huddled together out of the wind in a small, hastily dug trench. It was while they looked for shelter that Doreen had stumbled across an old garden fork, abandoned in the thicket. Splidge had the brainwave to use it to loosen the mud so they could dig a deep enough trench for them all to shelter in. The excess soil was piled up in front of the ditch to form a windbreak, and they pulled fallen branches over the top to prevent the deluge from turning their hidey-hole into a filthy swamp. All they could do was sit out the storm. Conversation was near impossible because the monsoon drowned out their voices. As the hours passed, exhaustion got the better of them, and they closed their eyes and drifted off to sleep. In the early hours of the next day, a tree crashed down onto their makeshift roof, ripping a hole through the branches, allowing the rainwater to pour in. Splidge woke with a jump. Water splashed onto his face, and he got up and hastily rearranged the displaced branches. Doreen stirred. "Are you all right?" Splidge asked. There was a bright flash of lightning, and he could see Doreen look cold, tired, and fed up. "Don't worry, we shall get off the island," he reassured her. Doreen sat up. "I know." Then, after a pause, she asked, "Where is home for you?" The wind had dropped, and they were now able to converse without having to bellow at each other. The conversation helped to distract Splidge from how cold and wet he was. "I live at the palace, but I'm from a village on the outskirts of the city. It's called Good Gud. Do you know it?" "No, I've never heard of it." "I lived there with my mother and my sister." "What about your father?" "Oh, he had to go away when I was young." "Go away? Where?" "To the wars." "Oh, that." "He'll come back one day. I just know it." The conversation lulled for a moment, and even though it was still dark, and although neither of them could see the crag, its rhythmic snoring confirmed it was in a world of contented dreams. "So what about you?" asked Splidge. "I suppose you live with your father, Baron Throgmorton." "Huh, not any more." "Oh yeah, you've run away." Splidge couldn't imagine what the poor girl must have gone through being brought up by such a hideous and dreadful man. "What about your mother? What's she like?" he asked quickly. "My mother died when I was born." "Oh, I am sorry." "It's all right. You don't miss what you've never had." Another flash of lightning lit up the girl's face. She must miss not having a mother, Splidge thought. "Do you miss your father?" Doreen asked. "Yes, very much. I wish he hadn't gone. I know nothing about the wars. They seem to be a big mystery. No one will tell me anything. Even my mother refuses to talk about it." Doreen reached out for Splidge's hand and squeezed it. "I know a little, and the truth is quite scary." "What do you mean, scary?" Doreen moved closer and lowered her voice. "There are monsters at the edge of Gud, and they are killing people." Splidge scoffed. "Monsters? How ridiculous!" Doreen withdrew her hand, and Splidge realised she was being serious. He groped in the darkness until his fingers connected with hers again. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. It just sounded a bit, well, you know, far-fetched." "Yes, I suppose it does. That's why the wars aren't spoken about. But my father has proof." "What sort of proof?" "He's mounted some of the heads of the monsters on the walls of our house. Others he put in glass boxes. They're hideous." "Really? What do they look like?" "Like nothing I've ever seen before. When I was small, my father went away on hunting trips, and he brought back horrible severed heads as trophies. He keeps them on display. I won't go in the hall any more. Their eyes seem to follow me around. It's ghastly." "Blimey," said Splidge, suddenly eager to go and look at them. "So are you saying that the Royal Army went to fight monsters?" "My father thinks so." A loud clap of thunder erupted over their heads. The storm was building again, and for a while the two of them sat in the cramped mud hole, holding hands, listening to the terrifying sounds of nature all around them. Splidge thought about his father and about what Doreen had just told him. Monsters? It sounded preposterous. Could it be true? Had his father found the army, and had he fought hideous monsters? Splidge had so many unanswered questions spinning around his head, but there was one in particular he wished to ask. He gently squeezed Doreen's hand. "Why were you watching me at the arena building?" Doreen shifted awkwardly in the muddy pit. "I was hiding from my father and his men. The open day at the arena meant it was busy, and I thought I'd be safe in a crowd. When I saw you arrive, I became curious. I knew my father had tried to scare you away from the palace and stop you working for the king. I just wanted to get a closer look at who was causing him so much grief." "Grief? How was I causing the Baron grief?" "It's not your fault. Let me explain. My father doesn't want the royal tournament to go ahead." "Why not?" "Because he's greedy. He wants the king to go bankrupt so he can take control." "How can he do that?" Splidge was confused. "My father is King Guddamac's half-brother, and all the time King Ralph is away fighting the wars, the Baron is the next in line to the throne. So if the royal Gud runs out of money, he can't stay in power and will have to hand over the kingdom to my father." "So why did he try to burn down the palace? Wouldn't he want to live there?" "Oh yes, that's one of my father's dreams. But remember, he only set fire to the throne room to make the king sell some land to pay for the repairs." "So what's this got to do with the royal tournament and me?" Doreen moved closer to the boy, the storm almost forgotten. "The royal tournament is the king's only means of making money, and my father is determined for that not to happen. He even made sure the previous Royal Cragflinger contracted and died of the plague. That's why the king had been advertising the job for so long. No one wanted to be the Royal Cragflinger because they thought they'd be contaminated too. When you came along, the king was desperate." "Oh, thanks a bunch." As the day of the tournament drew nearer, my father had one of his men, Brute, watch the market notice board with instructions to warn off anyone who applied. "Oh yeah, Pigface did try that," Splidge said, beginning to understand. "Yes, and then, when I saw you asleep, zonked out on the floor of the welcome feast, I was surprised. You were the kid that fixed my umbrella, and I thought you looked, well, nice. And then you woke up," she laughed, "and kissed me." "Oh, Guttersticks, How embarrassing. I thought I was dreaming." Splidge was pleased it was too dark for the girl to see him blush. Further rumbling in the sky drowned out their conversation, and they agreed they should try to sleep some more. Before she closed her eyes, Doreen said, "Don't worry, Splidge. I'm sure we will get off this island in the morning, when the storm has passed." Splidge agreed, although at that moment he wanted nothing more than to stay trapped in the mud hole with the lovely Doreen. When the morning finally came, the howling wind and the incessant drizzle had stopped. The storm had passed, and for once it wasn't raining in the land of Gud. Despite the damage, these extreme weather conditions are welcomed because a spell of warm weather usually follows, and there is much rejoicing. Property owners get up onto their roofs with hammer and nail, houses are repaired, cottages whitewashed, sheds mended, workshops improved, and gardens attended to. The king welcomed the timing of the storm. He hoped the sun might last until after the royal tournament. No one would stay cooped up in their dingy wattle and daub houses when it was warm and bright outside. The markets would flourish, businesses would thrive, and for once the underclass would smile. Umbrella makers disliked sunny weather. However, they cunningly transformed their brollies into parasols, proving a living was still possible for them in pleasant weather. It wasn't the sunshine that woke Splidge in the muddy trench. It was voices. He sat bolt upright and listened intently. He nudged the others, who slowly roused themselves from their slumber. It had taken them ages to fall asleep, so they were in no hurry to wake up. "Shush!" whispered Splidge, as the crag yawned noisily. It had been enjoying such a lovely dream. The three of them listened to the chatter of men trudging through the bushes towards them. One of them said, "How do you suppose Tubby's barrels got here, then?" "I don't know, George," replied another. "You'd think they would drink the ale first. What a waste of beer!" "Tubby should have given them to us to polish off, I reckon." "Do you think you could have handled it, George? I'm told it's very strong stuff. It knocked the king out, and you know how resilient he is." The men laughed, their mirth wafting through the brambles, and Splidge and Doreen exchanged glances. Who was it? How did they get here? And what would they do when they found the three of them hiding in the ditch? "Should we say hello?" Doreen whispered. "I suppose so, but what if the island's private property? Will we get into trouble for trespassing?" Splidge said. The rustle of branches and squelching of footsteps drew closer, then stopped altogether. "Have they gone?" asked Doreen, as quietly as she could. "Dunno," replied Splidge. The crag nudged forwards. "Shall I have a scout around? I'm small. They won't see me." "We need to find out if they're friend or foe. We don't want to crawl out and find it's the Baron's men looking for us," Splidge said. A large hand cast the branches aside, and a head poked through the makeshift roof. "Hello," it said. A round, moon-like face beamed at them, and the trench dwellers gasped. The face broke into a huge smile, flashing a mouthful of crooked teeth. "That looks cosy," it laughed. Before anyone could react, another face jutted through the greenery. It was a bit smaller than the first and a lot thinner, but both faces looked weathered, as if they'd spent a great deal of time outdoors. "How do?" said the thin face, with a high-pitched voice. Splidge, Doreen and the crag pushed aside the remaining branches and stood up to greet the strangers. "Hello," Splidge said, looking the men up and down. Moonface wore an enormous battered leather jerkin, with a bunch of vicious metal implements hanging from a wide belt, including a highly polished knife, jagged hooks, and a series of pegs and spikes. His brown flannel trousers tucked into thigh-high water waders. The thin one was similarly attired, and had a scruffy woolen cardigan pulled tight around his chest. It hung open, suggesting the missing buttons had pinged off ages ago. "What are you doing on the island, then?" Moonface said with a big frown. Splidge clambered out of the hole and offered his hand. "We got stranded here. My name's Splidge. I'm the Royal Cragflinger." "Nice to meet you," Moonface replied, shaking the boy's hand. Splidge noticed the big fellow reeked of rotten fish. "So, you work for the Royal Gud, do you, lad?" "Yes, I do." "I see. And who is this?" said Moonface, helping Doreen out of the hole. Spotting the crag, he screwed up his face in surprise. "And what is that?" "Is it a hairy slug?" interjected the thin man, bursting into a fit of giggles. The crag looked most indignant. "I'm not a slug." "It's my crag," said Splidge. "I throw it." Moonface bent down and picked up the orange mop creature and gazed at its button eyes. "You throw it? What at?" he asked. "I'm sorry," replied Splidge, retrieving the muddy beast from the newcomer. "I'm not at liberty to say." Moonface burst into fits of laughter. "What's so funny?" Splidge scowled. "Nothing," Moonface roared. "I'm just having a laugh with you, lad. I'm George, the Royal Fisherman." "The Royal Fisherman?" Splidge repeated. "Yes, and I'm the Royal Fisherman's mate," the slimmer man announced. "Don't mind us, laddie," said George. "We're just as surprised to find you here as you are us, aren't we, Freddy?" The cardiganed man grinned some more and gave a little wave. "We also work for the king," continued George, "although our paths wouldn't usually cross because I'm not based at the palace. I have a small cottage a few miles back along the river. We supply the fish for his royal goodness, and any extra we sell at the market." "Yes, the king does like his fish," added Freddy, having another giggle with himself. Splidge introduced Doreen, which caused a flurry of excitement and caution. Messing about with the Baron's daughter was ill-advised. No one wanted to get on the wrong side of the Gudian brewer. "Go on then, spill the beans, laddie. What brings you to the island?" George asked. Splidge gave a short account of their adventure, and George's moon face lit up with astonishment when he heard about the escape from the waterfall. Freddy couldn't help himself and giggled throughout like a 5-year-old. "I suppose you'd like to get off the island and head back to the palace," said the royal fisherman. "Can you take us?" Splidge asked. "No problem, lad. It'll be our pleasure, won't it, Freddy?" "Not half," giggled the slim man. "I could sleep for a week after this," yawned Doreen. "Thank you so much." "Well, our boat is standing by. We don't normally head out this far downriver, but we spotted a few of Toby Drake's beer barrels, so we came to investigate." "Yes, we saw those too," said Splidge. George led the way to his boat, through the windswept bushes and uprooted trees, back to the muddy beach. It wasn't a large craft, but solid enough, and it only just managed to accompany the 5 of them. An even stronger smell of fish emanated from the hull. "Don't mind the old trout," laughed the royal fisherman, pointing to a wooden tub full of their recent catch. Splidge wasn't too keen on fish, and found the lifeless eyes goggling up at him rather disturbing, so Freddy threw a sack over them. George pushed the boat into the water, and with surprising dexterity leapt aboard like an Olympic hurdler. He thrust the oars into the rowlocks and started rowing the fishing boat back upriver towards the city. Splidge felt relieved that soon they could change out of their wet clothes and sit by a nice warm fire in the cowshed. George's powerful biceps propelled the dinghy effortlessly, while Freddy untangled the fishing nets and stored them under his seat, while the rays of the glorious sunshine warmed them all. "Do you think you're going to win the tournament then, laddie?" the royal fisherman asked, pausing to rest a second. "I hope so. I'm quite new to all this," Splidge replied. George grinned and turned to Doreen. "What does your girlfriend think?" Splidge blushed. She's not really—" "I have every confidence in him," Doreen cut in. "Ah, that's love for you," laughed Freddy. "I wish my missus had confidence in me." George scoffed and began to row again. "You haven't got a missus. She ran off with a goat herder." "True, but I prefer living on my own." It was a long way back to the city, and the sunshine made them sleepy. The crag nodded off, lying on its back, sunning its pink belly. Splidge found Doreen's hand in his again, and after a while she leant against him, resting her head on his shoulder, with her sweet perfume clearly detectable. The fisherman's chatter faded into a distant murmur, and the young Cragflinger was soon lost in his imagination, walking through a cornfield, holding the hands of a rather fetching, raven-haired girl. The normally happy face of the landlord of the Hog and Bucket was screwed up in abject terror. Another man's white, gaunt and menacing cranium loomed inches from his. Bloodshot eyes bore threateningly into the terrified publican's brain. Tubby Drake had recoiled as far back as it was physically possible on the hard-backed wooden chair he had been instructed to sit on, and he trembled uncontrollably. The harrowing gaze from the other man was difficult to return, so he kept his eyes downcast. Tubby knew he was in trouble ever since the Baron stepped into the tavern the morning after the fire and discovered half the city drinking the publican's own special brew. And so, when the letter with the Baron's motif emblazoned on the envelope dropped onto the doormat, the alehouse keeper knew that he had been summoned to a meeting. Tubby Drake would have preferred to drown in a vat of sticky porridge than willingly step inside Frogmorton Manor and negotiate with the formidable brewery owner, so it was with great reluctance that the landlord trudged the mile-long journey and rang the doorbell of the Baron's imposing Gothic mansion. The glorious warm sunshine went unnoticed while he waited by the ominous black door, because little could remove the chilling dread of conversing with the Baron. And yet, Tubby had always known that if he wanted to run a tavern of his own, he had to dance with the devil. Giles Frogmorton was Satan in human form. Nature had not been charitable to him. His physical appearance was odious and repellent. The man's skin, like a delicate translucent membrane, was pulled tightly across his skeletal frame, revealing black, protruding arteries among a tangle of crimson veins. No wonder many joked that even the long dead would exhume themselves and run for the hills rather than do business with the Baron. "How good of you to come," hissed the cadaverous man, while he ogled his prey. "Anything to oblige, sir. I am your humble servant, of course." The Baron leered at the withering publican. To him the landlord was an errant child in need of strict correction, and he pitched his ugly face with its hook nose even closer. "You are aware of my privilege, Mr. Drake?" "Privilege, Baron?" "The royal licence I hold grants me the status of solitary brewer in this great city of ours. I am therefore surprised to discover someone else fermenting yeast and steeping barley." "Ah, yes, I can explain that. You see, the king said—" The Baron pressed a bony finger to his black lips, and Tubby fell silent. Snapping his body upright and pulling away from the quivering wreck, Baron Frogmorton crossed to a tall casement window on the far side of the room. He swept the curtains aside and glanced out at the sunlit scene beyond. From where Tubby was sitting, an enclosed courtyard at the rear of the house was just visible. A door in the courtyard wall opened, and the muscular figure of Brute entered. He shut the door behind him and carefully pushed a bolt across, and when the door was secured, he turned to the window and waited. The Baron gave Tubby a stiff smile. Then, sliding the window open and leaning through, he gave inaudible instructions to the pig-faced man. Tubby chanced a furtive look at the door next to him. Through there was a hallway, the lobby and the grand entrance leading out to the drive. He longed to be running up the drive, but the Baron's icy voice ended his hopes of freedom. "Come here. I want to show you something." Whatever it was, Tubby had no desire to see it. His reluctance to join the frightening man at the window had turned his legs to jelly. Sensing the publican's disinclination, Baron Frogmorton purred, "Come on, I promise I won't bite." The landlord of the Hog and Bucket moved across the room as if walking over a minefield. With each step he feared his life might be cut short at any second. There was no guessing what awful calamity the Baron had in mind, but when Tubby got to the window, the Baron merely slipped an arm around him, pulled him closer to his skeletal body in mock friendship, and directed his guest to view the courtyard. Brute was standing in the centre of the cobbled enclosure. Taking his cue from the Baron, the piggy-eyed man strolled over to a small wooden kennel. The tiny door had strong wire mesh for a window. Brute slipped a key into the padlock and pinged it open. Then, with great caution, he slid 2 bolts across. Tubby shuddered, and the Baron glanced at him briefly. "There is nothing to worry about. We are quite safe here." Brute didn't look very relaxed either. After sliding the last of the protective bolts, he rushed away from the kennel and hastily climbed up a stout wooden ladder and onto a small platform overlooking the courtyard. The platform was encircled with protective mesh, forming a giant cage, and Tubby was in no doubt that that was to protect Brute from whatever was in the kennel. The henchman picked up a bucket full of raw meat and tossed a chunk down to the courtyard floor below. Tubby's eyes followed the bloodied steak as it landed with a distinctive thud on the flint cobbles, and the sound reverberating off the brick walls added to his sense of dread. Baron Throgmorton leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I want to introduce you to a friend of mine." Brute reached into his bucket again and threw down a second cut of meat, then followed it with a third. The rancid odour of the chopped carcass wafted on the warm breeze across the enclosure and reached Tubby's sensitive nostrils. He felt nauseous. A noise, a deep guttural noise. Something was stirring in the kennel. A disturbing grunting sound was followed by intense scratching, like fingernails drawn over a blackboard. Tubby noticed the Baron had started to drool, and saliva gathered on his bottom lip. The cage door sprung open and banged against a wooden post, and Tubby jumped. A small, black, leathery paw slowly emerged into the sunlight. A vile creature, with its body shaved of fur and skin leathery and stiff, crept out. Its nose flared, and foam oozed from its mouth. For a second or two, it sniffed the warm air, and then, with lightning speed, the hairless beast shot across the cobbles, zigzagging this way and that, revelling in its newfound freedom. Its frenzy was protracted, dynamic, and frantic, and surprisingly fast for something no larger than a small pig, yet no one dared take their eyes off the savage creature, for fear it might leap at them. Tubby observed that the monster, with its pointed teeth and slobbering tongue, was covered with unsightly tattoos, making it all the more fearsome. The creature shot across the courtyard, crashing senselessly into the perimeter wall. Shaking its head, it then rushed suicidally to the other side of the courtyard and smashed into the wall again. It caught a whiff of the discarded meat, and its pug nose sniffed viciously before making a beeline for the flesh. Peeling back its foaming lips, it pounced. The meat was ripped to shreds and devoured in seconds. The tattooed crag sniffed out the other chunks of meat and polished them off with equal enthusiasm. Aware that it was being watched, it slowly raised its ugly head towards the window, blood blubbering from its jaws. It looked straight at Tubby. It gave a stomach-churning growl and bounded straight towards the startled landlord. Open-mouthed, with jagged incisors exposed, it flexed its muscular paws and jumped. Thud, it hit the glass. With impeccable timing, the Baron had slammed the window shut. It was too much for Tubby, and he had collapsed in a dead faint at the Baron's feet. Smelling salts brought Tubby round, and the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was the tattooed beast. It was jumping up at the window, trying to get in like an excited dog. Brute had a pole with a thick leather collar affixed to one end, and from the caged platform he held it out as if he was fishing to try and ensnare the menacing creature. The Baron helped Tubby to his feet and led the timid man over to the hard-backed chair. "I think you and I need to have a little talk." Of course, Baron. It's always a joy to exchange pleasantries with you," lied Tubby. Giles Throgmorton gave a curt smile. "I wish to talk about the ale you supplied at the welcome feast. Mr. Drake, you must not circumvent my generosity. Business is business, and we have an agreement. I supply the Hog and Bucket with all the beer it needs at the price we have agreed on. I care not what the locals think of my beer. If they complain it is too weak, has no taste, or looks cloudy, you must simply instruct them to take their custom elsewhere." "But you supply all the taverns in the city," Tubby complained. "The beer is the same everywhere." The Baron laughed. "Yes, my friend, it's called a monopoly. It makes commercial sense to have one uniform beer. That way the consumer knows what he will have in his glass before he orders it. He knows what it will taste like before he drinks it. He knows what it will cost before he pays for it. And because the price is fixed everywhere, everyone is happy." "But," Tubby protested, "people want to change." "Is that the reason you offered the king your own beer? What did you call it? Tubby's special brew?" "Yes, but I wasn't going to sell it to other taverns. It was just for the welcome feast, and any leftovers went to my regular customers." The Baron grimaced. "You don't understand, you simple-minded idiot. People talk. Others would hear of your new beverage and would want to come and try it." Tubby squirmed. I don't see the harm in that. Why shouldn't they?" "You may not see the harm in that." The Baron raised his voice savagely. He was incandescent with rage. "Did not a single tiny brain cell in that fat head of yours realise that if anyone who wasn't a regular customer of yours would, by default, be a patron of somewhere else? Did you not comprehend that if such a person was drinking in your tavern, he would not be drinking in his usual establishment, and by his absence he would not be buying beer from that place? Did it not strike you that the profits of his usual establishment would, as a result, be reduced? And did it not further occur to you exactly to whom these profits belong?" The Baron was ranting. Tubby said nothing and simply stared back. It was true, he hadn't thought of those things. He'd simply listened to his customers' wishes. They wanted something better to drink. The Baron's bitter was hogwash. It gave no satisfaction at all. Away from the city, rumours abounded of a thirst-quenching pint with a taste that put a rosy smile on your face. Those legendary ales were said to make you feel elevated, euphoric, and able to approach your work with a spring in your step. But in Gud City, all you had to look forward to was the weak, thin and tasteless slop that the Baron's brewery produced. Tubby dared not share these thoughts with the vile man, who towered over him, however. "So," the Baron continued, "you thought if your customers liked your brew, you could continue to make it on the quiet, did you?" The Baron had worked himself up into such a temper that colour started to appear on his otherwise cadaverous cheeks. "Are you not forgetting something? You are not a free house. You may run the tavern, you may lease the building, but I own the property, and I dictate which beer you are permitted to sell, and I might add your foul concoction is not one of them." Baron Throgmorton moved away from the captive and crossed to a large marble fireplace. He picked up a small silver alarm clock from the mantelpiece and absent-mindedly wound the tiny key at the back. Tubby watched him with furtive eyes. There was a similar timepiece lying on the ornate sideboard. Its clockwork mechanism had been ripped out like a dissected animal. "I have raided your cellar and had your barrels thrown into the river, and I expect that to be an end of Tubby's special brew." The Baron flung the clock down and strode back to the publican. He grabbed Tubby's jacket collar and, with surprising strength, lifted the quivering man out of the chair. "Now that we have had our little chat, you shall return to the hovel of your ale-house, continue to serve up the beer I supply, and you shall pay no attention to the whiny moans and ignorant gripes of your customers. You shall collect my profit and send it on to me as normal. If I hear anything else is on tap at the Hog and Bucket, or come to that any other public house in Gud City, I will come visiting with my hungry little friend from the courtyard, and next time there shall be no window to protect you. Do I make myself clear?" Tubby glanced out to the courtyard and saw that Brute had failed to capture the black-shaven beast. The monster snarled and growled viciously. With sweat pouring down his face, the overweight publican ran as fast as his squat legs would carry him back to the safety of the hog and bucket. Tubby Drake thundered through the tavern door, pushed past his wife, and rushed down into the cellar. The mash tun and the barley hopper and all the other brewing equipment he had recently purchased was smashed up beyond all recognition, carried outside, and dumped unceremoniously into the stinky black moat. The lesson had been learnt, and the message made clear. You don't mess with Baron Frogmorton.